In this video, Jordan Peterson explains conscientiousness being a good predictor of long-term life success.
Conscientiousness is a good predictor of long-term life success. It's a good predictor negatively of divorce. So more conscientious people are less likely to get divorced. It's a really good predictor of grades. It's a decent predictor of income. It's a good predictor of social status, eventual social status. It seems to be particularly good at predicting outcomes for people who are engaged in managerial, administrative, and process management occupations. And so all of those occupations are characterized by the necessity of reliability, integrity, and attention to detail. It's not associated with creativity, right? That's openness. So the open people are better artists and entrepreneurs by all appearances. So altogether, conscientiousness seems to be a relatively positive trait. And so then you might wonder why there's a distribution, right? Like, why isn't everybody hyper-conscientious? Well, it appears, at least in part, that as with all the other personality dimensions, there's increasing price to be paid as you deviate from the average. And so unconscientious people, they tend to rely on others to support them. They're not particularly ambitious or reliable. But they're not particularly rigid either. And so one possibility might be that low levels of conscientiousness are an asset at certain times when combined with other traits. So, for example, the data isn't all in on this yet, but it seems to me quite likely that orderliness, which is an aspect of conscientiousness, so conscientiousness breaks down into orderliness and industriousness. And those actually seem to be importantly different. I think orderliness probably puts an additional constraint on creativity. So we've studied entrepreneurs for a long time. And it's clear that higher levels of orderliness certainly aren't associated with entrepreneurial capacity. And I have the sneaking suspicion that that's because, orderly people are very concerned with doing whatever needs to be done in the particular way that it's supposed to be done. And the problem with that is that if you're creative, so if you're engaged in a creative enterprise, the thing flips around on you a lot. Like there's a lot of transformations as you're moving towards the end. And that's not exactly something an orderly person is going to appreciate. I also suspect that orderly people are they're too likely to obey rules to be entrepreneurial or creative. Now obviously obeying rules has its utility, right? But it doesn't when the rules are wrong, or when they start to interfere with something that might be conceptualized as a higher value than the rules themselves. For conscientious people, it's not self-evident that there are more important values than following the rules and doing things properly. And so, that's part of what makes them reliable workers and decent citizens and all that sort of thing. It's also partly what tips them towards conservatism on the political spectrum. So the best predictors of political conservatism are low openness and high conscientiousness, particularly orderliness. So actually liberals and conservatives don't seem to be much different than one another in terms of industriousness, but they're quite markedly different in terms of orderliness. Or, you could say, well, what predicts liberalism is high openness and low conscientiousness, particularly orderliness, because you don't necessarily have to just be predicting conservatism. So now, you remember the big two model. So conscientiousness lumps in with emotional stability and agreeableness to produce stability. And as people age, they become more stable. They become more conscientious, more emotionally stable, and more agreeable. And you probably interpret that somewhat pleasantly as an improvement in maturity. And conscientiousness is quite highly correlated with neuroticism negatively. So it turns out, generally speaking, that the more conscientious you are, the less neurotic you are. And we think that that might be actually because of the tendency of conscientiousness as a trait manifested across time to stabilize environments. You know, so if you're a conscientious person, imagine that because you're conscientious but not perfectionistic, let's say, you stay on top of your homework and you get your assignments done, let's even say ahead of time. Well, partly what that means is that the amount that you have to worry about how you're going to be doing decreases. And of course, if you're conscientious, over time, your field of opportunities opens up from an employment perspective, plus your income increases and you've stabilized the environment around you, and so there's less uncertainty in it and more security. And so, you know, it could easily be that conscientiousness has its effect on neuroticism by stabilizing the environment, taking the uncertainty out of it, and then making people not so much really less, like lower neuroticism, but just less likely to be anxious and in emotional pain in general. So